Hey Toby, what do you want to do today?
Exactly the same as every day, Bibi. We will conquer the world.
But we already did that yesterday, didn't we?
Really? Then, well, what about talking about creativity? Cars can't fly? We show you that with creativity, everything is possible and that this wonderful ability is in every single one of us.
Listen now and learn more about your personal creative ability and its importance for you, for organizations, and for society.
So, hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Talking Creativity. Today we talk about creativity with David Cropley. He's a researcher and educator who sits right at the crossroads of engineering, creativity, and innovation. David's career has been dedicated to a fascinating question. How do people and organizations consistently come up with new ideas, and how do you turn those ideas into something really useful in the world? He has spent years working with engineers, designers, and decision makers to help teams understand creativity not just as magic, but as something you can study, teach, and also apply. And while David can absolutely go deep down on how innovation actually happens, we're also here for the really important details. So if David could only eat one dish for the rest of his life, he has made the bold and very surprisingly joyful choice. It's ice cream. Not one flavor, not one brand, just the entire category. That's a real commitment to ice cream. And his most adventurous moment is also something you do not hear every day. As a kid around 1982, he once illegally crossed the DDR border, which immediately raises two follow-up questions for me. How and what on earth possessed young David to do that? We will find out, I'm sure about that. And finally, the debate is settled. Nutella is never alone. David is firmly in the always butter with Nutella club, and honestly, he applies the same principle to any other spread. That's crazy. I have to say, I'm still not within this Nutella and butter club, but maybe I'm slowly getting into that. But one thing's for sure, there's no dry toast on his watch. Now, enough from my side. David, very, very welcome to the show. Welcome to our podcast, Talking Creativity.
Thank you. It's great to be with you. And you know, the Nutella thing, it's like you don't drive a car without oil in the engine. And it's the same, you know, you don't eat any spread without butter on the toast as the basic lubricant. That's my logic.
Yeah, but you need the right oil, you know, because you cannot put olive oil maybe into the car or something.
But maybe it's a good point. I mean, I've never thought like, would you just pour olive oil on a piece of toast and then Nutella? Would that achieve the same function? I don't know. I'm happy with margarine, with butter. Either one is okay, but there's got to be the grease to sort of smooth the passage of Nutella or peanut butter or whatever it is into my body. So
I would actually be curious if people really use other things than butter next to Nutella.
Yeah, we've already uncovered some potential for creativity here.
There's also this special spread you have in Australia. How's it called?
Vegemite.
Vegemite, thank you.
Yeah.
That is a very specific thing. Are you able to kind of explain a little bit how that tastes? Because I tried it once. It was not made for me.
No. It's made from. It was originally made from brewer's yeast, I think, as a sort of leftover byproduct. But apparently it's quite, you know, it's full of like protein and vitamin B, so it's quite good for you. So children kind of are given it, you know, when they're little children starting to eat things. I grew up outside of Australia, so I've never eaten Vegemite, and I think it's disgusting. Okay. But I've got all three of my kids. As soon as they started eating solid food, we give them butter toast with Vegemite and butter. It's a bit like in England, they have Marmite, which is similar kind of, you know, extract sort of thing, but it's a very sort of British Australian thing, and it's talking about grease and so on. It's, you know, it looks and smells like axle grease, but apparently it's very good for you.
Yeah, interesting.
Interesting.
Yeah, and this whole Nutella with and without butter discussion, I think there's some new people on the block, because just recently I had a discussion in my team, and there was this. We ended up in this discussion about palm oil that is really, really bad for environment, etc. So there's some people moving away from Nutella to nocciolata. I don't know how that pronounce it. A different Italian one. And actually, that was the moment in my life as well. It was a few years back when I also started to eat it without butter, because this nocciolata is so tasteful that I don't like it with butter. The original Nutella, I had still butter on it. So can extend that discussion. But the podcast is not called Talking Nutella, but it's about talking creativity.
Exactly. Yeah. But one other question that's still also on my mind is about the border, David. Can you tell us a little bit more about that journey?
It's a good story. In fact, I have an old DDR cap there. But so the story was, I lived in Hamburg as a kind of young person, a teenager. My father was a professor at Hamburg University, and when I was I think it was 1982, so I was 15. My grandparents visited from Australia. And that was my dad's parents. And of course, his father had been a soldier in the Australian Army. In the war, he was very interested in seeing all things related to the after effects of World War II and so on. And so we went on a bit of a tour. And of course, one day we went to the East German border. And so there was a place back then, before the fall of the wall, there was like touristy areas where you could go on the West German side, and there was like a platform and you could look into East Germany and see how terrible things were there and so on. And I was a bored teenager, so my grandparents were there looking with my parents, and I wandered away a little bit, just wasting a bit of time. And when I was about 100 meters away from this little tourist area, I realized like there was some trees, and I could see there was a little stream maybe 2 meters wide. And in the middle of that stream, there was a post with a sign on it saying, "This is the Grenze." And I thought, well, that's interesting, but it made sense because, of course, all the barbed wire and stuff was on the East German side. And so here is the border, then there's all the barbed wire. And it suddenly occurred to me, there's nobody looking, nobody can see me. So I took a little run, jumped over this little river, and thought, I'm in East Germany now. And the East German guards couldn't see me from 500 meters away, and so I stood there for a couple of minutes thinking, this is kind of cool, I'm in East Germany. And then I thought I'd better leave now and jumped back onto the West German side, and then went, and I think maybe like the next day I told my parents so they didn't get too upset or concerned.
Oh my God.
But yeah, it was kind of, nowadays I think it's actually quite interesting to think, to see all that back then and think, what a funny world we lived in then and how different things are now. But that's my story about illegally entering East Germany during the Cold War, not as a spy, but just as a bored teenager.
So it just came out of boredom, actually.
But it means technically I've escaped from East Germany, so.
Exactly. But would you say you have taken this braveness and this just doing things because of curiosity or boredom? Have you taken this throughout your life?
It's a good question, and it's a very creativity question. Probably, I think it was more sort of youthful stupidity than openness to experience and so on. And probably nowadays, like if I saw my kids doing it, I'd think, oh my God, what are you doing? Are you crazy? So I think, it was, but it does show how, it is very relevant for our conversation because, of course, part of the challenge of creativity is overcoming some of these, sort of instinctive barriers. And some people are able to sort of push back that, that the sort of wisdom when you get older and think, oh, that's not a good thing to do. Some people can still sort of suspend those feelings of following the rules and so on, which helps them to be more creative, whereas other people kind of impose those restrictions on themselves. So, and I think it is a characteristic of, children, teenagers, maybe don't think things through as much. And so that's probably one reason why kids especially younger children, tend to be more creative because they're not afraid. They haven't yet absorbed the rules that we've sort of created for ourselves. And so there is kind of a creativity lesson in that story.
That's the perfect transition into our topic,
Yeah,
David.
exactly.
And you already gave a little bit of an explanation what creativity is to you, but still, again, it's always our opening question. So I have to ask it again. But can you kind of boil it down a little bit to what is actually creativity to you?
Yeah. So I've got like the very short elevator pitch answer of 7 words, and I've got the slightly longer version. But to keep it really simple, to me, creativity is the generation of effective novelty. 7 words. But to sort of expand on that a bit, a more descriptive version is that creativity is the ability to coordinate elements of cognition, personality, and environment in pursuit of effective novelty. So that kind of brings in the fact that some of creativity is how we think, some is our willingness to take risks and our openness to new things, like we were just describing, and some is also to do with the environment in which we work. And if those things are kind of functioning favorably, then we maximize our chances of producing effective and novel ideas. So it comes down to the real core of what creativity is producing novel things, novel and effective things. But how we do that brings in personality and thinking and so on.
Mm-hmm. And how would you say, how are you being creative, both in your private life, but also in terms of work life?
Yep. So I mean, personally, it's always it's kind of an awkward question, isn't it, for a creativity researcher? Because I think if I say, well, I'm super creative, people think that guy's an arrogant jerk. And if I say, well, I'm not very creative at all, people probably think, well, what's wrong with this guy? So I mean, again, it's a nice opportunity to sort of bring in some of the theoretical ideas behind creativity. So I think the perfect answer for me is that it depends. So in relation to some of the foundational aspects of creativity that determine whether anybody's creative, like your ability just to generate unusual ideas, then I think I'm probably somewhere above average at that. And also, I think in terms of these things like being open to new ideas, taking risks, being tolerant of different things and so on, I think, again, I'm somewhere above average. Whether that's partly because I've absorbed all of that by, doing creativity research or partly naturally like that, maybe it's hard to say. But then there's also a sort of a more domain specific or a kind of job specific element of creativity. And so I always say to people, like, I don't think I'm creative at all, for example, in the field of painting. So I'm hopeless. I can't draw. I don't paint and so on. But in the field of doing creativity research, I think I am quite creative. And so what I'm describing brings in these two elements. Like if you want to be creative, you've got to have a certain kind of set of basic skills that are relevant for everybody. But most adults like us are creative in some particular thing. So in addition to those basic skills, you then have to have the sort of the job or the domain specific skills that help you to deploy your creative thinking in a particular way. And that's why you can be creative in creativity research, but uncreative in painting is because it ultimately comes down to sort of more domain specific things. And so, like I say, the answer, am I creative? The answer is always, well, it depends. I think I've got certain foundational skills and the ability to apply those in certain things. But it means that, yes, I think I'm quite creative in the field of creativity research, but not necessarily in other things.
Interesting.
It's not black or white, right? Because I think many people think I'm either creative or not, but it could be that you have, just as you've mentioned, if I understood correctly, that you could still have the skill of being creative and also build or improve the skill of being creative in your specific area. So
Yeah.
it should not only be the case that I'm creative in general, it just can be in my respective area, right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean that's exactly it. As you described it. It's not black and white because there's this sort of two basic elements of certain general skills and dispositions that help
Yeah.
anybody to be creative, but also you've got to be able to apply that in a particular area. And in fact, there's a third element which is the technical skills associated with the area. Like if I knew how to put paint on canvas and use a paintbrush, then I could probably use my foundational creativity skills to be a creative painter. But the deficiency I've got is in the technical skill of painting. So what I mean. So there's general creativity skills and dispositions. There's job specific skills, and it's only when all of those things sort of come together that you see a person is a creative writer or a creative painter or a creative researcher or whatever it happens to be.
Yeah.
I just wanted to transition a little bit into your profession, David, or profession. I would rather call it like your focus area of creativity research was also a long time related a lot to engineers or engineering jobs and stuff. So that is a perfect fit to our background in the company of Siemens, because we have a lot of engineers doing also creative work and stuff. So I'm really curious, can you share a little bit about what you learned throughout the years of research there? And do you also potentially perceive a shift there? It's potentially a stupid question, but do engineers need to be more creative today than in the past? Is there a change you see?
It's a very good question. And in looking at one of the sort of guiding questions here, I think that really sort of helped me to focus on this. My answer is I always say to people that, and in fact I've written one or two publications about this, that engineering is perhaps the ultimate expression of creativity. And so kind of getting back to your point, I think engineers have always been creative. And in fact, the reason engineering is creative is because the essence of engineering is design, and the essence of design is solving problems. And if you have to come up with new solutions to those problems and you're an engineer, you're talking creativity. So especially when I talk to engineers, I always remind, you guys, you're super creative because this is the essence of what you do. However, what I would say, it's not that, that sort of somehow, this has been lost. It's more that I would say, I was thinking about this earlier today, is that maybe since World War II in this sort of modern era, or maybe a bit more recently, say in the last 50 years, that there's sort of a shift in people's expectations of technology. And I think over the last 20, 30, 40 years, society in general has come to expect a very high standard from technology and engineering. In other words, people get very intolerant if things don't work. The very success of engineering is also kind of part of the problem, that we've raised people's expectations. And so, when you buy a new smartphone or a car or whatever, you just take it for granted it'll work. And in fact, nowadays, electronics has become so reliable that, if you buy a television, for example, it's highly unlikely that anything will go wrong with that TV, possibly for 20 years, because, the standard of things like electronic engineering is so high, and the stuff is so reliable now. So we've kind of created a monster in that people have this very high expectation. But also what's happened, I think, is that society has therefore sort of shifted its focus to the effectiveness part of creativity. And that's kind of overwhelmed the novelty part. And so I think there's been almost this sort of it's not deliberate, but I think a lot of people, customers, organizations have kind of forgotten about the novelty element of engineering to some extent.
That's
However, what's changing again in maybe the last decade is that with the rise of automation and AI and so on, we're coming back into a period of much more rapid change. And rapid change, of course, means that we get lots of new problems arising. that need new solutions. So I think we're sort of seeing an upswing again where there's more focus back on novelty, because we can't just keep doing the same things to solve these new problems that come along. And also things like climate change and social and economic changes mean that we've gone through a period where you could just do things better and better. But now we're going into a period again where better is not enough, that it's also going to be different because the conditions of the problems have changed. So I think we're in the midst of seeing a greater focus again back on novelty as well as effectiveness. And those are the two key components of creative products. So I hope that kind of explains the answer. But I think that there's good days ahead for engineers, because there's more of a premium again on the creativity part, the novelty part of engineering. And the good news is, as we'll probably talk about later, is that AI can't do that bit. It can help you make things better. Well, it can help you make things faster and cheaper, but it can't necessarily help make them better or more creative. So there's still that important role for human engineers in this environment that we now find ourselves in.
Interesting. Do you see a difference if you look globally in terms of be putting things on the market and potentially it doesn't work right away perfectly? So this is typically attributed to China, for example, that the people there are more accepting just products on the market, and we're going to test it with the first customers, basically, compared to Germany. If you kind of ship the product there and it doesn't perfectly function, it is kind of negative for your image and for your brand, etc. Do you see a difference and therefore also an advantage for China here, for example?
Well, I think you're right. And there is a difference, and a lot of that is cultural. And again, I go back to, in Western countries, I think we've become less tolerant of failure and so on. And the main engineering discipline that I teach is systems engineering, so large, complex systems. And that's especially the case in systems engineering, perhaps more so than smaller scale products, because a lot of these complex systems, they cost so much. We're talking billions of dollars, that failure is unacceptable. And we see this a lot in, for example, in things like new hospitals or large transport systems or defense systems like ships and submarines. And the level of tolerance of failure, especially by governments, because they're often the organization paying for it, and therefore taxpayers, is very low. If something goes wrong, there's always scandals in the newspapers, and people get very upset. So we've become very sort of financially risk averse, I think, in a lot of Western countries, where maybe in a country like China that has, the only way they can sort of compete or have competed over the last few decades is to do things a bit differently to sort of catch up. So, I think that whole sort of cultural perception of tolerance for risk and so on, which directly ties to creativity, is different. And maybe we've got to recapture a little bit of that. And it's not, I always point out to people, I'm not suggesting that we go crazy and just say, effectiveness doesn't matter, just make things, and if they break, it doesn't matter. But there's a balance, and if it's been sort of balanced like this, where this is novelty and this is effectiveness, it's not doing that and reversing it. It's just trying to get it somewhere back in the middle, where novelty has a little bit more of a role to play in order to find ultimately good solutions to problems.
Interesting. So balanced out would be always the preferred option, or the ideal situation, let's put it this way. And could you elaborate a little bit more on the engineers itself? So you mentioned you're telling your engineers, hey, what you're doing is super creative. How do they perceive that? Do they see it the same way, or do they just do their job, or how do they react when you're telling them that?
Yeah, and that's good. I would say they love it, because a lot of engineers I teach some undergraduate engineers, so younger kids who are 19, 20 years old. And they like hearing it because they feel good about it, and compared to a lot of the things they study, which is mathematics and physics and so on, I think they like having a course where we're actually talking about solving problems. But I also teach a lot of master's level students who are often people who've been working for 5 or 10 years, and they love it as well, because for them, they're sort of rediscovering why they got into engineering in the first place. I always say to these people, you didn't become an engineer because you like writing documents and, and sort of just doing that kind of dry administrative, report writing work. You became an engineer because you were interested in technical solutions to problems. And the stuff I teach them is kind of re-embracing that, or rediscovering that the essence of engineering is solving problems. And whenever the conditions of the problem are different and new, you've got to find creative solutions. So I think engineers of all levels love it because it's reminding them of what engineering is really about and why they got into it in the first place. Yeah, so I think it's a nice way for engineers to sort of to re-embrace the essence of what they're trying to do.
And I think that's super valuable that you bring that in and that you remind them about that, because I think many people lose that because, as you said, it's more on effectiveness, just having the focus on we need solutions fast and not about the creative process. But how would you say, do you also help them on the how to get from the problem to the solution? So you also mentioned you're doing creativity research and all of that stuff. You bring that also in, or how do you help them to be more creative in that entire process?
So a good question and an important question, because it's not just giving them a pep talk, and saying, no, you're all creative people, now go off and be creative. But the next question, of course, that they'll ask as well is, okay, if creativity is important, then what do I do about it? How do I build that into what I do? And there's a couple of examples, but that kind of gets us then to the discussion of what are the basic stages of solving a problem, not just in engineering, but in fact in solving any kind of problem. And I usually use the example that there are 4 basic steps, which is the first thing you've got to do is actually understand what the problem is. And once you know what the problem is, and even the engineers at Siemens and so on, they'll talk in terms of user needs and stakeholders and requirements and so on. That's just the language that engineers use to describe what is the problem. The second stage is that once you know what the problem is, the core kind of creativity stage is then generating ideas. Then once we've generated a bunch of ideas, we need to evaluate those ideas. So this is where it gets more mathematical and technical to work out, of all the ideas that I've come up with, which are the ones that I should focus on. And then the final stage is that you pick the best idea, you implement a system or prototype it, and then you test it to see if it's actually solving the problem. And so the answer to your question is that we can go straight into saying, well, we all understand that there are stages to problem solving in engineering in general. And when we break the process down by stages, then we can begin to see not just what sort of skills and tools and techniques are necessary, but which tools and techniques apply in the different stages. And we can start to sort of fine tune how we make use of creativity. So it's important that I'm not just saying to them, go out and be creative, but I'm saying, at the right time in the process, there are certain things that you need to do and ways that you need to think that will help maximize the effectiveness of each of those stages. So it becomes kind of more technical and more, trying to think of the right word, more sort of specific to the particular activities. But I think that's good because, it's very easy just to say be creative, but to be much more kind of tailored to the stages of the process, that's where it becomes kind of useful and practical. And it also makes the point that, as I said before, that not everything has to be creative. Like sometimes you still have to think like an engineer, and that's appropriate. But as long as you're doing that at the right stage, and also at the time when you do need to be out thinking creatively, then you've got to sort of change your mindset, think creatively for that period of time, but then you can move back into a technical evaluative stage later on. So it's all about knowing what are the right things to do and when is the right time to do them.
After listening to your story about this different stages and stuff, I just had one person and a saying in my mind, because very often people reply to this and say, yeah, that's all good, but I'm so constrained here. I'm not able to think creatively along those, even though I have those steps and those stages, but there are so many constraints. What would you reply to that person?
Yeah, so the whole issue of constraints is a good one. And again, I was, with your guiding questions, I had a chance to sort of, assemble my thoughts on this. But, constraints are very interesting in engineering. And I generally tell people that constraints are good. And again, when I'm teaching systems engineers, I always make the point, like, engineers can't build a system based on statements like it should go fast and it should look cool, because those are too vague and qualitative. That's how customers often describe things to you. But the first task of the engineer, not just systems engineers, any kind of engineer, the first job is to translate those statements in the language of the customer into engineering language. And part of that is going from this vagueness down to more specific, measurable, objective statements. So it's a necessary part of engineering, because you can't build a system without objective, measurable statements. And you also can't test the system without those same objective goals and so on. So, and as soon as you go from saying, I'm building a vehicle and it's got to go fast, as soon as you translate that into it should go a minimum of 60 kilometers per hour, then you've constrained the solution. But that can also be good. And I mean, it's good in a sort of simple sense, because, as soon as you've got some sort of goal, then that helps to focus your creative thinking, because, you're not going to consider options that are hopelessly irrelevant. And you're not going to consider solutions. Like, if you're building a vehicle for somebody that has to go 60 kilometers an hour, it helps you to narrow down to a more feasible set of options, because you can rule out jet engines and you can rule out rubber bands, and it puts you in the right sort of ballpark. So the energy that you focus on coming up with a creative solution is focused down, into a reasonable subset, and that's important for maximizing your chances of actually finding a solution. Because otherwise, you could spend 100 years investigating every possibility and still never converge on a solution. So, and the other reason constraints are good, especially in more complex systems, is that in a complex system, the different elements, of course, interact with each other. So a constraint on one part also has a kind of knock-on effect to the other parts. And what often happens in a complex system is that we get trade-offs. So we realize that if we increase this thing here, then we decrease this thing here. And those constraints, again, it gives you a sort of a set of rules for where to look for the creative solution. So I always try to present constraints as a good thing. It helps focus the time and the resources that we have. Instead of having a problem that's that big, we get it down to here, and then whatever sort of limited time we have available to do some creativity, is more focused and more productive. So I always see, constraints are necessary, but they're also helpful for actually direct attention and directing our creativity.
Interesting. So that's the very logical thing, right? The interesting part is just that the people are coming back again and again with the same story. Hey, I cannot be creative. So I totally get that. But it's also part of kind of, because we're touching upon a lot about the different stages, etc. But what I also see is like, how do you call that? Potentially the attitude of the people, the willingness to really go into new things. Like, I don't know, potentially it's also a lot about the personal fear of being judged, of doing something wrong, etc. So because if we talk to engineers, it's very often a lot about logical reasoning, etc. But the very other side of your mindset, the emotions and all those fears and stuff are equally relevant from my point of view for really being creative in the end in a team, in an organization. What are your thoughts about this other side of us as human beings and creative
No,
work?
I agree. In fact, I'd say, the constraints are a given, but the thing that makes the difference and why the engineers might still come back and say, "Oh, it's too difficult. I can't be creative." It's nothing to do with the constraints, but it's easy to blame the constraints. It's almost certainly to do with the more human side of the creativity, which is their own attitudes and dispositions. The things we mentioned before, their openness or unwillingness to embrace risk, but also the element we haven't mentioned yet, which is for, in simple terms, the company culture or the team culture. So, I've often used the examples. You can be the most creative person in the world, but if you go to your boss and say, "Hey, boss, here's a great idea," and they say, "Shut up and get on with your job," then that's the last time you're going to speak up and be creative, because you'll be ridiculed or punished for it. So in a team, in an organization, if you had to sort of put not a percentage, but if you had to say where's the biggest lever here, it's not having team go and do a brainstorming course or anything. It's getting the culture right, getting the attitudes and both of the individuals and the team leader or the organizational culture, getting that right. And of course that means creating a culture where it's okay to try things. It's maybe okay to fail. And again, that doesn't mean, an organization going crazy and just, wasting resources and doing crazy things that fail. Goes back to what we said before. It's about knowing when to do that and when to allow a little bit of that. But equally, there are other times when you have to say, no, today we're evaluating an idea. So today is all about the right answer, focus, and doing the work. But tomorrow we may be doing some idea generation, and then we have to sort of come into work and say, today it's about having a bit of time and space. It's about trying some things without feeling silly, and it's about giving the team members support. So what makes it difficult is that, say, team leaders and the management in an organization, it's like conducting a huge orchestra where you don't just go in and sort of press the play button, but you've got to be able to go in and know that even possibly for the next hour we have to create a little culture here that's like this, but this afternoon the culture might be different. And so you're playing this game of constantly sort of shifting and adapting to, again, doing the right things at the right time. And I think where a lot of organizations struggle is they set up a monoculture which works for some things but blocks other things, and then they sort of scratch their heads and think, why isn't this working? And it's because that you've got to have this very adaptable culture to support creativity, doing the right things at the right time.
Maybe to also emphasize what you were also saying and discussing, do you have some examples from your experience where you could really feel or see that maybe an engineer failed with their first idea or something, or maybe every other direction, but then it turned out to be a really successful one? Do you have something concrete you could share? Some examples?
Yep. That's the example I was thinking about for this. It's not kind of a big organizational example, but it comes back more to sort of individuals and how they embrace risk and unusual ideas and so on. I thought a good one, because it's got a little bit of a German link to it, is I don't know if you guys are familiar with the story of Hedy Lamarr. She was a Hollywood actress in the 1930s and 40s. So Hedy Lamarr, famous actress in the 1930s and 40s, so before and during World War II. But she was actually, I think, originally from Austria or from Europe, and went to the US. What's interesting about her is that although she was a Hollywood actress and was regarded in her day as the most beautiful woman in Hollywood, she did a lot of basically tinkering and sort of inventing as a hobby. And so she was a very creative thinker. The other interesting thing about her is that prior to the war, I think in the early 1930s, she was actually married to an Austrian guy, Friedrich Mundell, who was basically a weapons manufacturer. So she had a little bit of sort of knowledge through her husband about weapons and things like that. So jump forward to World War II. She's in America. Maybe she wants to sort of show she's a true American, a patriotic American. She was tinkering with ideas for how can I help the war effort and so on, which I regret means she was coming up with creative ideas against Germany, but she came up with this idea of the Germans actually in World War II invented radio-controlled missiles and torpedoes. So that was an example of German creativity. We see a lot of creativity, of course, in wartime. She, I think, knew about this sort of concept from her previous marriage, and she came up with the idea of how can you make a radio-controlled torpedo that can't be jammed by the enemy. So she so in those early days, they had basically torpedoes that would run near the surface so they could pick up radio waves, and you could steer them onto the target by sending radio signals from an aircraft circling around. You could steer the torpedo or a missile. But she realized that if you wanted to jam those sorts of radio-controlled torpedoes, all that people had to do, all the enemy had to do was just send out a more powerful signal on the same frequency, and then you wouldn't be able to steer your torpedo. So this is a bad thing. She came up with the idea of if you could have the aircraft controlling the torpedo and the torpedo, if they could communicate by constantly jumping to different radio frequencies, then it would be impossible to jam those torpedoes. Mm-hmm. Now, nowadays, people say she basically invented concepts of Wi-Fi or what's called spread spectrum technology. She didn't really, but she invented a concept that sort of underpins those things. But here's where it gets really interesting. Here's the crazy idea that shows how sometimes very effective novel solutions come out of apparently, nutty ideas that you would never connect to the real thing. She had a colleague, a pianist and composer called George Antheil, I think also a German or an Austrian originally, who was, produced music and so on in Hollywood. And she described this idea to him, and he said, you know what, we could solve this problem by using pianolas. So, like I wrote it down here, Selbstspielklavier, selbstspielendes Klavier. Had these paper scrolls with the tune on it. He said, if we connected one of these pianolas to the radio transmitter, say in the aircraft, and if we had another pianola in the torpedo, now not really, but the mechanism, then if they were playing the same tune, and every time the note changed, that represented a different radio frequency, then your radio signal could constantly jump to different frequencies, but anybody else listening would have no way to follow what was going on. And the piano is very good because, a grand piano keyboard has 88 notes. So on the scroll of the pianola, you've got 88 different signals. And if you just make each one of those 88 notes a different radio frequency, then as long as the transmitter and the receiver start at the same time and they're playing the same song, then you have this unjammable radio communication system. They built like a prototype, not obviously with a torpedo in the water, but just a receiver and a transmitter. They got this working, and they were actually awarded a patent for this by the US government in 1942. Now, it didn't actually result in any real system being built during the war, but in the 1960s, once they moved from valve technology to integrated circuits and so on, it was the basis of a sort of anti-jamming system that the US then built.
That's a great story.
But it's that, you had to be open. You had to not just have the technical knowledge, but you had to be open to these. I've got an idea, but the question that requires the creativity is how can we achieve that idea of hopping around different frequencies and connecting that up with another person who had a certain expertise. And when those two things came together, this idea that the piano scrolls give you a way of synchronizing radio signals is an important and apparently crazy thing, but a very practical solution to a problem. And it's creative because it was a very novel idea, but it also worked. So it was very effective.
Nice,
Wow.
nice story. So how playing a piano saved some people from getting anyhow. So it's in the end it's still war, but it's a nice idea. I would love to, because our time is running out. I would love to shift our focus a little bit to our, I would say, hopefully still some time for that left, but our last topic that is close to your heart, I guess, David, because it's your most recent work. It's AI and creativity. So I know that you kind of share a lot of your current findings on LinkedIn, and I know that there's, of course, a big hype about it. A few months and potentially a year ago, a lot of people said, hey, AI is more creative than humans. And in our workshops and daily work, we very often perceive the situation that when we kind of sit together and say, okay, we need to generate now some ideas to this and that topic, people say, okay, I'm going to ask ChatGPT. Let's see. So what is your take on that situation? And is AI really creative?
Yeah. So, I mean, I got interested in this very early on when large language models, appeared sort of in the general public in late 2022. And I mean, because almost straight away people started saying, oh, they're so creative. And I thought, well, I'm a creativity researcher. We have established creativity tests that are, many of which are verbal in nature. So it seems like here's the perfect way to test a language model. And we can apply some of these tests. And we've got a benchmark. We know what the average sort of human performance is on a lot of these tests. So let's see how large language models do. And well, if you restrict your concept of large language model creativity just to the ability to sort of generate divergent ideas, then yes, large language models can be quite creative because, there's a common test that you guys may have seen called the divergent association task. And there's a website for this, and it's just, you have to pick 10 words that are as different from each other as possible. Now, this was set up before large language models, and you can do that test, and you have to try and make the words as completely different from each other as possible. And researchers have shown that correlates very strongly to creativity. So I thought, well, let's give that test to a large language model. Now, it can do quite well at that, and it can score higher than humans. But one of the problems with that is every time you ask ChatGPT to do that, you don't know whether you're going to get the highly creative answer or the highly uncreative answer, because there's that element of sort of statistical uncertainty in the LLM results. And so just as you do with humans, if I did that 100 times with ChatGPT, you get a nice distribution of results. The mean value for ChatGPT is slightly higher than the human mean, but sometimes you'll get a terrible answer, sometimes you'll get a highly creative answer. So that's one aspect. And to answer your question, if we were just basing creativity on that, then I'd say to people, well, it's slightly better than the human average, but it's risky because at any given moment you may get ChatGPT the idiot, or you may get ChatGPT the genius, and you can't predict which one. So it's unreliable. But a more practical answer is, what if you ask ChatGPT or other large language models to do a more creative task, not just generating a list of 10 words, but let's say we ask ChatGPT to write a story and make it creative. That's where it becomes more sort of focused on real problems and real solutions. And what already a number of different studies have shown is, and writing again is a good example, is that large language models aren't actually very good at writing creative stories. And I mean, without going into the detail, there's some pretty solid evidence. Like if you get expert judges to look at those stories, and these are people like professional writers, editors, and so on, who work in creative writing, the human stories are always better than the LLM stories. But this is where it gets interesting. A key differentiator is if you get and it goes back to what we said right at the beginning, if you get an amateur human writer to write a story, then the large language model may well be better than them and more creative than them, because you're comparing basically a non-professional human creative writer with a large language model. And let's face it, the whole point of large language models is that we tip everything into them, we stir it around, and it's no surprise that what we get out of it is kind of a human average. And so if you're below average and the large language model is capable of producing average creativity, then as far as you're concerned, it looks fairly creative. So some people, it's a bit like, I don't know, religion or politics. Some people will tell you until they go purple in the face, large language models are creative. Whereas other people say, no, they're not. And the key here is that it depends on your level of creativity relative to the large language model. Now, in recent research of mine, what I was able to show kind of mathematically is to confirm these other empirical studies with a sort of theoretical model that shows that large language models are only capable of average level human creativity. And like I said, that's backed up by empirical studies of things like writing, but it's also backed up now by this sort of theoretical kind of mathematical approach that I took. And so I'm certain that it's correct to say that large language models produce average creativity. And then the question, like for the people you work with, is to say, if you're happy with average creativity and if that's useful to you, then okay, use a large language model. But if you need above average creativity because this is a particularly new problem or something like that, then if you're relying only on large language models, you're going to be disappointed. Now, that doesn't mean that the LLMs are useless, because the stage that people are now turning to is saying, okay, well, what if we sort of have a combination of humans plus large language models? Is that the way to sort of to get to extract the most value? And I think that's the sort of the promising line of approach is don't just assume that the large language model will give you creative answers, because it's not capable of doing that. But it may be useful as a way to get started. And I'll give you one final example. We know from lots of research on brainstorming that it takes a bit of time for the good answers to come out. This is when humans are doing brainstorming. So if you spend 20 minutes brainstorming, the first 10 minutes, say, are usually the terrible ideas that people just have to sort of get out. And, it seems like it's a necessary prerequisite to sort of unload the uncreative ideas. And once you've unloaded those creative ideas, then you start to think of, but if we did it like this, that would be better. And where I see some promise with the large language models is that basically the large language model is a quicker way of getting the stupid ideas out of the way. So it can still accelerate the process. And that means it's doing what computers are good at, which is doing things faster than us. And in this case, it's get the sort of routine, uncreative ideas or the average ideas on the table quickly, and then use those as the sort of the way of stimulating humans by saying, okay, here are the dumb ideas or the average ideas. Now that we've seen them, it's easier for us humans to actually say, right, how could we make that better? So it's still useful, but we just have to understand what it's really capable of, what it's not capable of, and then work out what's the best way to exploit what the large language models can actually do. And so they're still useful, but we've got to use them wisely.
I can just echo that, to be honest, because in my work, I'm now within executive communications, so I need to write a lot as well. So what I do, or how I see it, is normally that I really use this as an inspiration, or kind of to just get some first ideas, but then still I need to work on it and I need to be creative. And that's also the fun part, I think. And I think even it makes more fun to have kind of like an AI sparring partner that can also give me some first ideas, but still in the end, I will talk to my human colleagues and elaborate on those. So I think that's also quite nice to know, and also to hear that you're saying that still, I think our creativity in the end will be even more valuable. And that would also be my question in terms of engineering, because what we see, for example, with Siemens, we also introduce co-pilots, for example, for engineering. So help our engineers become faster in coding, for example.
Yeah.
Also here, I would say then engineers need to maybe code less, but be also a little bit more creative when there's problems coming up. Is it that way, or how would you say it? How do you see it when it comes to the world of engineering?
Well, I think it's, I mean, you've given a good example, whether it's coding or, I mean, even like systems like Lego, I mean, once upon a time, like if you want to create a little model of something you're trying to build, people used to make models out of wood or plastic or Lego or, other, other sort of systems for building things. That we do that to sort of help us understand what the problem is and to work out things that need to be improved. So if you can create code, or if you can create models and so on faster than you could before, that's a useful way of getting to the right answer quicker. And it's the reason we use computer-aided design and so on for the last 30 or 40 years. It's a faster way of doing things than drawing technical drawings. It's faster to do that on a computer. So of course you use the computer, but it's still a means to an end. It's still a tool that's helping us to get to do the clever stuff that engineers do. And so, like I said, whether it's coding or whatever, if we see it as a tool that helps us to get to the interesting stuff faster, that's good. And the only danger is, for some reason, with AI and large language models, unlike CAD packages or software packages, some people seem to look at the large language models and just get sort of bamboozled by them and think they give such human-like answers. And there are some people who kind of can't help but think there's a little human in the machine, and that it's it's sentient. I mean, you've just got to keep reminding yourself it's just a computer program. It's fast at doing certain things, but it's just a computer program, and it's there to help me get to the things I need to do faster and more efficiently than. And I think, I mean, most engineers, I think, use it in that way. The other little cautionary note, of course, with large language models is this propensity to hallucinate and make errors. So, it adds that extra layer that we've got to be on the lookout for these inadvertent errors, and it sneaks them in such a convincing way, that we've got to keep reminding ourselves this is just an algorithm, and even though it presents the information in a seductive way, we've got to remind ourselves it occasionally makes errors. So, I mean, if the machine can write the code, a human still has to check it, to make sure that it's not got stupid mistakes in it. But, your example with writing marketing material and so on, there's nothing wrong with saying, I need some ideas just to get me started. But I'm sure that you look at the ideas and these are all crap. But now that I've seen some bad solutions, I know how to write a good one myself and
exactly, yeah.
Isn't there another perspective as well that is challenging in like human AI interaction regarding creative challenges? What I see is, because we also touched upon it and you said it as well, David, it's also about the problem understanding and problem framing at first, because I mean, you only get out from the AI what you ask for, right? But if you think that this is the right problem, then you might go into the totally wrong direction, perhaps. But giving the people the understanding that, giving people the understanding that part of creative work is also figuring out the problem space at first. I don't know if people use AI also for discovering the problem first. I haven't seen it and noticed it so far, but is that, I don't know, just wanted to hear your perspective on that as well.
I think those are also very valuable ways. And that kind of gets back to understanding that there are different sort of activities within the broader process of creativity. So we shouldn't just sort of think that everything the AI does is creative. I mean, what you're describing is using something like a large language model for the things it's good at, which is, more evaluative things and algorithmic things. So, getting an AI to help us kind of think through the nature of the problem and so on is a very good idea because it's got access to a lot of information. But that's not the large language model being creative. It's actually the large language model being very, very kind of evaluative. But if that is a useful aid in one of the broader stages of creative problem solving, then absolutely, we should use it because, like we said before, I mean, any tools that help us conduct this whole process faster and more efficiently to get from problem to working solution has got to be a good thing. But again, we just have to understand where and how to insert those tools. I was having a conversation recently with someone else, and we were talking about the fact that for some organizations, the problem is they think the AI is a plug-in replacement for a human. And so they look in terms of the product, the AI, instead of looking at the process and looking at what do we actually do in this organization, and where could this program, this piece of software, the large language model, actually improve that process, and where do we still need humans? So I think what you were describing, Bianca, is this process approach of saying, what are all the things that we do in this organization, and where can we exploit a large language model to derive extra value from it? And of course, my main focus is just don't think that it's going to give you creative ideas. Use it to be more efficient. Use it to test, ideas and your understanding of what the problem is. Use it to generate some average ideas as a means for getting more creative ones. Use it to help you evaluate those solutions, but understand it's not some magical sort of super creative being, which I know you guys know that. But if we use it correctly and use it and analyze what it can do relative to our processes, I think that's the sort of the secret for getting the most value out of it.
I think that's the perfect ending, to be honest, because you really emphasized it very well or summarized it very well. Or Toby, what would you say? I think we touched upon many topics. David,
super interesting insights.
Yeah, learned a lot. But there is a final question. What would you give our listeners now as a takeaway, or what would be the next 1 or 2 small steps they could take after listening to this podcast from you to also be a little bit more bold, be a little bit more open towards creativity?
So I've got 2 for you, which and both of these are kind of, you can do this at home or you can do it on the way to work. So the first one is, and I've used this for a long time, as a way of practicing the sort of core divergent thinking element of creativity, and this is a nice one for engineers as well, is first of all, think of an everyday object. And an example I use is, say, a screwdriver. And then when you've got that object, then ask yourself what function, or what does that object do? Like a screwdriver, the purpose of a screwdriver is to screw in screws, but that's too specific. So I say, think of the function of that object in as abstract a way as possible. And so again, the example is a screwdriver. The purpose of a screwdriver is to apply torque, apply rotational force. And that's a nice open-ended description of the screwdriver. It's a device for applying rotational force. Then the divergent thinking bit is then say to yourself, okay, now let me come up with 10 different ways that I could apply torque if I didn't have a screwdriver. And that's just a sort of, it's just a brainstorming exercise, but it begins by not just, random brainstorming, like let's think of 10 different ideas. It's sort of directed towards a particular function that has some meaning to you, and then saying, how would you? I always use the example, like if your car broke down in the middle of the countryside and it was nighttime and raining, and you needed a screwdriver to fix your car, but you'd left your toolbox at home, then how would you replace the function of that screwdriver just using things that you have available? So it's just this idea: pick an object, describe its function in open-ended terms, then think of 10 other ways that you could perform that same function without that object. So that's the first one. And like I said, you can do that. You can do that on the U-Bahn, on the way to work. You can do it as you're walking down the street. The second one, which is more focused on some of the personality aspects of creativity, is, again, every day, on your way to work, try going to work by a different route. So if you drive your car to work, go a different way than you normally go. I mean, not ridiculous, like don't start driving in the opposite direction, but think, instead of, normally I go on the Autobahn here for 10 kilometers, try a slightly different way and see what happens. Or if you take public transport, you maybe change trains somewhere and take a slightly different route, just to sort of experience being open to change and to new ideas and taking risks. Because we know that psychologically, the more that we practice these personality elements of creativity, like risk-taking and openness and tolerance for uncertainty, the more we practice those, the more we get used to what it feels like, so that when we have to do it, say, in our job, we know that the world's not going to end. It's not a terrible thing, that taking a bit of a risk is okay, and we feel more comfortable with it. So basically, practice being open to new ideas, taking risks, tolerating ambiguity. And like I said, the easy way to do that is just go to work on a different route. And maybe you're 5 minutes late, but that's okay. Or the other way you can do it is, like, whenever my wife and I go out to a restaurant, we usually end up going to our favorite Indian restaurant. And I always eat the same butter chicken, and so another way to practice this is deliberately say to yourself, we're going to a restaurant tonight. We're going somewhere we've never been before. And when I get there, I'm going to eat something I've never eaten before. And it's about this idea of immunizing yourself to the psychological discomfort of taking a risk and being open to new ideas, because the more you practice doing those things, the easier it becomes. And because that's a vital component of creativity, we can help get better at creativity. So practice the divergent thinking with the way I described, and practice being open to new ideas and taking risks. I'll finish with one thing. I did this myself today. When I was thinking about these examples this morning, I finished up at about midday, and I thought, okay, time for lunch. So I went out of the university and I walked into a sort of shopping street, and there was a guy there with a sign saying free hugs. And at first I thought, oh, that's stupid. And I was about to walk past, but then I thought, no, I've just been writing about being open to new
Oh
ideas
my
and
God.
taking risks. And in that sort of fraction of a second, I thought, I'm going to have to do this. So I went up to the guy and said, come on, give me a hug. Gave a hug.
Oh,
and
I love that.
I 5 minutes after thinking about this answer, I actually had an opportunity to sort of test myself. And I'm pleased that I passed the test, that I, instead of staying in my comfort zone, I did something that normally I might think is a bit silly or a bit uncomfortable. And for the next 15 minutes, all the way back to the university, I was thinking, I'm going to tell these guys that I did this thing today.
And you
Wonderful.
did it. Oh my God, I really love that. I think we always have to be more, mindful about things, just more active and really just doing it, because on a daily basis, we're so much into our routines.
Exactly.
We don't even think about getting out of the comfort zone because we're just doing it. So very, very inspirational, David. Thank you so much for sharing that. I think I will do it now today.
Yeah.
I gotta get out with a big sign, free hugs now for my lunch break.
Or you can just wander around
Wonderful.
the office with a sign.
Yeah.
That's next level then.
Yeah.
So wonderful. Thank you very much. And bye-bye out there, dear listeners.
Thank you
Thank
very much,
you.
guys. That was great.